Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalwarowsky. Susan is not available this week. She's actually right now at her cottage sitting in a hammock. Oh, well, we'll just say she's sitting in a hammock. But she's enjoying a little bit of the summer vacation and getting her rest and recovery in. So that's cool. And so, as always, we got to start off the pod with a quote. And this one comes from a McKinsey report that just came out this morning. And it's talking about 10 big findings that they've found in their most recent survey on people, leadership, and organizations. And the quote that we want to start off with is they found that 25% of leaders are the ones that are self-aware and inspiring. So the vast majority of folks out there who voted in this poll and in this survey found their leaders uninspiring or not self-aware. And the quote that comes from their post of the top 10 findings is, leaders today need to be able to lead themselves, lead a team of peers in the C-suite, and exhibit the leadership skills and mindset required to lead at scale, coordinating and inspiring networks of teams. To do that, they must build a keen awareness of both themselves and the operating environments around them. So as always, we love this quote. And joining me hearing that voice is a special guest, a friend of mine, and we went to college together. We've known each other since, what would have been, like 2007, I think.
Yeah.
Is Eliis Kim. Ellis, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Rob.
Absolutely. So first, before we get into you, what do you think about the quote?
Well, I find it really interesting that even the language, it reminds me of IFS, internal family systems. Like, leaders need to be able to lead themselves. That's like the very first part of the quote. So one of the most important things about IFS is getting to a point of being self-led as opposed to being manager-led or firefighter-led. So I find that fascinating. I don't know if
it's wild you'd get that from McKinsey, but yeah.
Well, that was the next thing that I was going to say. Like, I have a part of me that's like very, very skeptical because McKinsey's writing it. Not that they're not a reputable firm, but like, management consultant. So it's fascinating. Maybe the IFS language is making its way into the corporate world.
We can only hope. And so Ellis, obviously, like, folks are going to be new to you, but we do want to kind of get into some of those cultures that you've obviously seen when you worked in finance. So before we get to that, let's talk about you first and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm a psychotherapist in private practice. So I serve clients, mainly adults, in California and Massachusetts. And geographically, physically, I'm located in Los Angeles. I recently moved here from Boston, where I was for a couple of years. And so I work with people dealing with a whole variety of experiences, including many post-traumatic issues like depression, PTSD, anxiety, like unsustainable ways of coping, which can include drug addiction, people going through life transitions, something that both you and I have done, and a variety of other issues. So I have a lot of clinical interests. It's just kind of how my mind works. I'm not focused on just one thing. I don't think my career will be that way. But some of my many clinical interests as a therapist include working with people like yourself who either originally come from a STEM background or who are still in that world. Very interested in experiential therapies like internal family systems and somatic therapy, and also working with people of color and second generation people. Those are both groups that I belong to, but many other interests as well. So that's what I currently do. But as you mentioned, I had a first career. So we went to MIT together as undergraduates. I was 1 year ahead of you, right? Yep. So I studied economics as an undergraduate, and I spent most of the first decade of my career on Wall Street. I was first an investment banker at a large bank in New York. And then I spent most of the next several years working at a hedge fund as a trader, at first as an analyst, but then as a trader and an investor. And then around the time I was 30 or 31, I went back to school, got a master's degree in social work, and now I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So there's a
Amazing.
lot of
Yeah.
details in between, but those are kind of the broad points.
Yeah, and we've been really in contact a lot actually. So for folks out there, we met as part of the trading club at MIT, so the finance club, and we used to go. I think it was every Friday. We talked to this gentleman who was like had two seats on the NYSE, and he
Yeah.
was like incredibly wise about all things trading and finance. And the best part I liked was he always had lunches for us.
Yeah. That's true. It really kind of brings me back, and it's funny that that's how we met. So yeah, the person you're talking about is my late mentor, Mike Epstein.
Yeah.
So he was a retired trader, and he passed around 2009 from old age and health concerns. But yeah, he would bring in people like that he knew from his career. So like other traders, investors, people from like big firms like Fidelity. And he had a very colorful, long, interesting career. Um, and I learned so much from Mike about the stock market, markets in general, trading. I met people through him. But I think that really interesting, like when I reflect on that relationship, is it was really the person that I think that had the biggest impact on me. Like Mike was a great mentor and he was a great friend.
Totally.
Uh, so he was a wonderful influence in a variety of ways. And I guess I didn't even think about it. Like Mike is maybe one of the reasons why I met you, and you've been, a friend ever since.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Mike was that part, and I guess Ellis, what I want to sort of lead you into here is like you spent a long time on Wall Street and you worked at, one of the biggest banks in the world as an investment banker, and we kind of talked a little bit up top about, these cultures at, management consulting firms, and I want you to sort of lead folks into it is like what do you see in those cultures, and then also like what are the sort of the IFS ways that those people are being led versus being self-led?
Yeah, these are really interesting questions to me. So maybe before I even answer that question, I can tell you a little bit about like how I think I ended up in those spaces.
Yeah.
So I think my interest in finance, part of it was when I was in my earlier years in college, and I think the years after college, I was very blended, as we would say in IFS, with a manager part of myself. I was hyper fixated on trying to make as much money as possible, achievement, prestige, many of the same parts of me that had even, led me through MIT and helped me kind of succeed as a student. And so I think that just, my own story, I think is probably informative when we talk about like what types of people end up in these environments. There's a lot of different types of people who end up there, but many of them have that in common with me, which is it's people who are blended with manager parts of themselves. And so when you have a critical mass of people who have this type of internal system, one thing that we know, and one thing that I've observed a lot as a person and as a therapist is people's internal systems, their internal environments often get reflected in the external environment. And so it can be systems that have a lot of rigidity, cultures that have a lot of rigidity, workaholism, people imposing stress on each other, people not being empathic. This is kind of a stereotypical kind of finance or particularly like investment banking type of environment. So what I was saying a second ago about the internal system gets reflected in the external system, I think this is actually one of the really important reasons why leaders need to do work on themselves, because one quality of being a leader is your internal system gets amplified through the external system, whether that's a business, a community, it could be an individual family, it could be political systems. So their internal worlds parallel their external worlds. And so if people can't tolerate or hold, let's say, vulnerable, sensitive parts of themselves, they probably will be rejecting it in their partners, their friends, their coworkers, their employees.
Totally. And that's the thing I think that's so important, and why even the McKinsey thing, but why we always talk about doing the self work first, is when we talk about destructive leaders, and there's the 6 different types of destructive leaders that I talk about in my Asshole Boss talk, but it's like very much these ones are either aggressive or passive, but they're very much focused on themselves, right? It's egocentric or narcissism, or I want to feel important, or I want to feel seen, I want to feel heard. These are all the deficit strategies that they pull from. And that's where the manager parts are really leading the charge. And sometimes in extreme cases, obviously the firefighters are stepping in as well. But it's like, as we start to uncover these parts and allow ourselves to become self-led, that's when we can access that empathy and compassion for ourselves and also then for others. And that changes what we're willing to do. So prime example, right? You mentioned workaholism, right? And so for me, and I don't know about your core, but for you as well, it's like what got us into MIT was this obsession about working and delivering and performance. And this was, for me, it was around self-acceptance. And so I had a part that said, hey, Rob, you're going to work really hard and you're going to be the guy who delivers regardless of what you have to do that. And so basically you work incredibly hard and then you deliver, and then that's what gets you an MIT, that's what gets you A's, and that's what gets you out into the world.
Yeah. So for you, you sense that your manager part, one of its missions was about being the person who can deliver.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. That's
Yeah,
fascinating.
that was always super, super important to me, was this element of like my coaches always were really, I guess, happy that I was like working really hard all the time. And so that was something that like I took pride in, was like, hey, I'm gonna hammer it. And then like it's similar, we always talked about, right? Is like we weren't the smartest people at MIT, obviously.
Not even close.
And like in polo, like I wasn't the fastest swimmer or the strongest person or shoot the hardest or whatever. And it was just like but we had this ability to just lock down and make it happen.
Yeah.
And I think that was super important to my core identity.
Yeah. So in IFS, a classic question would be, like, if you get in touch with this part of you and ask, like, what is it afraid would happen if you weren't the guy who delivered?
Yeah. And the answer to that, and this took years of deep work, right? But it was acceptance from my dad, and therefore lack of self-acceptance. So if I don't get accepted by others, and this was a lot of the depression and the suicidality that I had at my first job, was like, I thought I was delivering, but nobody else did. Or my manager wasn't my actual boss. He was not able to accept it because he had his own stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Like you, I have a part of me that drove me incredibly hard when it came to working, first studying, but then working.
Yeah.
And I think when I did this work around myself, I think there was an element of being someone who could deliver and who could execute and achieve. So I think that was part of it. For me, I sensed that at least a good chunk of it was around money. So I think like it's not a coincidence that I went into a field where if you reach the heights of success within the definitions of this industry, you can make like insane, absurd amounts of money. And there was something about that really appealed to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty clear when I did the work that it was protecting me against the real instability that I experienced and that my family experienced as immigrants and as people who just kind of struggled with precariousness. They were immigrants to this country. My parents were from Korea. And I saw my parents have a lot of challenges and instability. And like, for example, like my own dad, like he spent a lot of time going back to Korea and like working there. And like there was a lot of time that I didn't have with him. That was painful. That was one of my exiles. Done so much work around that exile. And I think that this manager part of me said like, well, if I'm really successful, if I make a lot of money, that kind of thing can never happen again. And so when I asked the same question I asked you of myself, like what is it afraid of happening if it doesn't push you so hard? It's like, oh, like maybe I'm going to have to relive that.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? So, and this is what I want folks to sort of be thinking about is the behavior can be the same, but the cause or the root of the behavior can be different, right?
Absolutely.
So Ellis's root and my root were different, but we still were doing the same thing, basically doing the same thing, right? And so that's where starting to do the deeper work and getting under that surface level is going, and it takes time, right? It took me 2 years and probably a few hundred, it was at least a few hundred like deep EMDR IFS sessions and I don't know, 20 something ketamine sessions to get to that moment where it was like, oh, I actually don't accept myself and I never felt accepted. Right?
Yeah.
And for me, even money meant acceptance. Because my dad was super like money focused. Obviously, his parents were immigrants from the war. So it was like this thing about they were always worried about money. And then we were worried about money. And then it became this whole thing. So did I lose you?
That's a burden passed on through the generations.
Yeah. And that's trauma, right? And maybe talk about that a little bit, Ellis, about how does trauma get handed down?
Yeah, that is a very big and a very important question. So are you still there? I just lost your video.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it off because until my internet comes back.
Okay, got it. Yeah, how does trauma get passed down through generations? So, yeah, I think that maybe the way that I'll choose to answer this question is maybe through an example. And it's an example that that's connected to my own family and my own family system's connection to the legacy burden of colonialism and imperialism. So, as I mentioned, my parents are immigrants from Korea. They immigrated in the 70s and 80s, and I was born in the United States in the 80s. So I'm American born and I'm second generation. My dad and my mom were born right around the time of the Korean War or right after. So that alone, like if we just started from the 50s where Korea was in shambles after the Civil War, there was poverty, there was, it was the type of situation where like literally people wouldn't grow as tall because there wasn't enough food. People would die, like in the war. There would be families split apart. Well, one part of the family would end up in the north and one part would end up in the south. This is a very common story. And so just like imagine the amount of pain and heartbreak and grief and just suffering that came just from a civil war. And like that's the environment that my parents had their formative experiences in. So they came up basically in survival mode, more or less from day one. So they were people who have very strong managers, probably some firefighters as well. And when people become parents, they kind of by definition have power within their own family systems. They're leaders almost by default. And like I was saying earlier, what's going on in people's internal environments get reflected into their external environments. So the types of kind of implicit messaging that I would get from my parents would always be around survival, or very frequently be around survival. So being extremely practical, working incredibly hard, never leaving anything to chance, messaging around academics, money. And so unsurprisingly, the burdens that they got from this kind of extreme environment that they were born into, some version of that was passed on to me through the attachment relationship between the parent-child relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I just want to echo that to folks, right? So things that I heard from my dad were like, hey, you have to do well in school so then you can do well, you can get into the best college you can get into, and then you can get a good job, and then, right? And then you'll get the like house with the white picket fence and a dog and a wife,
Totally.
and you'll be set, right? And
Yeah,
the other thing was like, hey, you have to take a degree in something that you can get a return on investment from. Like you can get a job with this degree. So
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah. And so like, I think for folks out there, it's like once you start thinking back about what was the messaging that your parents used, then you can start drawing a parallel to how that impacted you and the behaviors and the beliefs you created to, I guess, go with that or work towards that, which may not be you as self, but it was definitely a part of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I are both talking about how some of the legacy burdens from past, large-scale catastrophic events got passed down through generations. So, Rob, I think you said that your grandparents were immigrants. Was it from World War II?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Which country did they come from?
My grandfather was from Ukraine. He
Ukraine.
was a POW and then
Hmm.
was in England. And then he immigrated to Canada. And then with my grandmother.
Okay, got it. So you're talking about World War II. I'm talking about the Korean War, the Korean Civil War. And so these are past events, and past events that are fully over, they very much ripple through. And we're both talking about how this has been true in both of our lives. Trauma can also be passed on when the legacy burden is an ongoing issue. And I hear Richard Schwartz talk about this more and more. So like in America, there is the legacy burden of white supremacy and racism. And so that's something that just continues to exist. Like when my parents immigrated to the US, they're, immigrants who didn't speak English, or they didn't speak English very well. The systems and the laws were set up, not for people who looked like them, and not for people who were immigrants like them. And that's yet another stressor. It's yet another form of kind of pressure and trauma that promotes kind of being manager led. And like you have to, again, not leave anything to chance. You have to be very careful about risk. Everything you do has to have survival as one of the first priorities. And that's without even like acknowledging that there is, racism. Like my parents and I, we never talked about racism until we were older, but that's just kind of the environment they came up in. It's still here, right? Like that's something that I'm subject to and that it affects everyone in this country. So it can be past events, and then there is the ongoing legacy burdens that still exist.
Totally. And this is where I just want to have folks, like we talk a lot about this show, is like, how do we transition workplaces or environments that have toxic leaders into this leadership 2.0 self-led type of person? And obviously what Ellis and I have been talking about this whole time is like that person needs to do the deeper work. Otherwise, it won't be possible. Now, folks, the deeper work is scary, and we also have protector parts that shut down our ability to look at that ourselves and look at that work as something that we want to do. So when I talk about asshole bosses and I talk about people making decisions about staying or going at these companies, sometimes it's very much about, well, one is it looking at yourself and being like, what is actually supporting me, and connecting to that decision that you can make that allows you to be the best or have the best outcome for you. This is also hard. But it's also looking at the leader and being like, do they even have the capacity or will to do the work? And if they don't, then it's likely you want to leave.
Yeah. Rob, I have a kind of big picture question related to the leadership work that you do. So you're trying, among the many things that your organization is doing, is you're trying to help leaders access more self and be more self-led in their work. Are the leaders primarily in like work environments, like corporate environments, like, or where are these leaders coming from?
Yeah, I mean, we have like the primary amount of my work is done with corporate leaders in the IT space.
In the IT space, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess a question that I have is, what is the ultimate point? What's the ultimate end goal of these leaders becoming self-led?
For the ultimate end goal for them or for us?
For them.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can talk about it from our own experience, right? And it's for you, it was this ability to leave finance and do what you love in therapy and explore a new avenue. For me, it's basically similar, right? Like I was able to leave engineering, which literally was killing me. And like I talk about this a lot, but it was like the morning after I tried to commit suicide, like I went to work.
Yeah.
And it's like like there was no choice that I could make that was like, oh, you know what? Like I literally almost died yesterday. Maybe I should quit my job because it's killing me. Like that wasn't even a thought that came into my mind. And that's the power of this element of like your manager and protector parts just shut down some of the self because it's scary, or it's this element of like, what happens if you don't have a job, then like you won't be accepted as a person, right? But then it was, after, a few years of deep work, it was like, okay, well, I'm quitting Enbridge and doing this. And then it was this year, it was, hey, I'm moving to Costa Rica because I really want to.
Yeah. Okay. Helping people access their own humanity, their own innate wholeness. Okay. The reason I asked that question is, I think there's a skeptical part of me, maybe in the language of IFS, that makes me wonder, okay, Rob, are you familiar like with you must be like kind of culture around mindfulness,
Yeah.
like the use of mindfulness in corporate spaces. So one of the issues that I have with the use of mindfulness is sometimes it feels like it's mainly being used as a means to an end to make people more efficient at working so that you can like just work more. And so it doesn't seem like a tool for getting more into a state of self, but like what I would call like getting into like a self-like part, or it's what IFS would call a self-like part, that has kind of like qualities of self. So like maybe it could be calmness, that would be one associated with meditation, could be patience, might even be something like empathy. But if you look closely, there can be more of an agenda, like there's like this subtle agenda related to efficiency or working hard. And so that's what was behind that question. And so
Yeah.
I think,
And I
yeah,
mean,
go ahead.
Dick talks about that in No Bad Parts, right? And I think he said it on the show as well, is like there are elements of leaders that use this work. Well, their parts are using this work to make themselves work harder or be more effective at work, right?
Yeah.
And that's an outcome. Like literally, like how you sell corporate folks on this work is like your people are going to be happier. They're going to perform better. They're going to take less sick days. They're going to turn over less. They're going to produce more. Their productivity is going to be higher. Their creativity and innovation is going to be higher. All those are real benefits that, CFO and CEO types want to hear, right?
Hmm.
And so there is an element that you are selling those financial hard benefits to get, to get those programs in. And then ultimately, like, I think what the benefit from the participant side is most of them just say to me, like, I'm happier in the day that I have, and I'm calmer and I'm less stressed. And they're not changing jobs. They're not, you know, it's not this like what we did where it was this huge career transition. We're doing something completely different. They're just, they're connecting with their people better. Their team's becoming happier. They're building more trust. They're building more psych safety. The
Hmm.
performance goes up, but ultimately them and the team are happier and their stress levels come down, which is,
Yeah,
obviously is good for their families, good for their mental health. Like all those things are great.
absolutely. And I actually imagine some portion of those people, like there's an opening created where if there is some part of them that they've been suppressing for a long time, maybe more creative, or maybe a part of them that's much more interested in doing other types of work. I imagine you have helped create that opening for some of these people, and some of these people will make big transitions over time, even if
Yeah.
that's not the stated goal.
Yeah. And we do get some of that. I mean, it hasn't been necessarily career transitions, although some have switched jobs, but I don't think that's really like a huge thing. Like that's just normal turnover. But it's like we had one person who was a year or two from retirement, and she said like, "Hey, I've always wanted to learn about archaeology." And so she was going to stay in her job for another 2 years, but she started taking classes of archaeology on the side with the university. And then when she retires, I think her goal is to go on a dig. And it's like, that's pretty cool, right? And
Mhm.
like often we do have folks take up hobbies on the side, like whether that's music or sports or like being more active in the community or churches. It's like they do that because they've realized that they need that. And if you talk about the 6 pillars of resiliency, like these are some things that folks don't have when they're working 14 hours a day, but they're bringing it in.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, ultimately just work harder and make more money, right?
Yeah, that's the thing that I'm very skeptical about. um, Rob, I've known you for such a long time and we've been friends for such a long time. I thought maybe it'd be interesting, like if we could kind of like talk about like what we've seen in each other, like
Yeah,
as we've just kind of observed, not just observed, like I think we've supported each other, we've been there for each other. But like, um, can I share like what I've seen in your progression and your journey over the years?
absolutely.
Yeah, so like I think the first thing that I'll say is like to the people listening to you like on this podcast, it's not that you're a completely different person from the person I knew 15 years ago, but you are a transformed person. And it's quite powerful for me to see and to have had the continuity. And I talk to you pretty regularly throughout those 15 years. Like there wasn't really a period where we weren't in contact.
Yeah.
Um, like when you just graduated from college, um, I think that you were blended with very harsh parts of yourself. And maybe it's what you were talking about before. Like there's this part that drove you so hard and like to kind of be the person who could get something done. And my sense is that like our school in particular, it gave you like a medium to do that in. There was a lot of structure. You also had athletics and water polo. And then I think that part within the environment of some of the workplaces that you were in, it didn't have that same structure. And I think it started to get turned back onto yourself.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And I saw you suffer a lot. I think I saw you suffer with depression, suicidality, I think just like hopelessness. You had parts that were depressive, suicidal, and holding a lot of hopelessness. And I just remember like just talking to you and not sometimes I felt like worried about you. I was actually worried about you. And like, I think there were times when you were worried about me.
Hmm.
And I think that one thing that's kind of very special and important about my friendship with you is like, I think we've both just seen each other go through a lot and we've just been there for each other in kind of the most basic and human of ways. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, me too. And I think that's like, to be honest, I mean, you're spot on. Like I always, even I think about it now and I'm like, MIT was the perfect spot for me. And it was like I look at folks who went to, like my sister went to a different college, like there was some local colleges, and I was like, it never would have been the same. And even we had that exchange program with the folks from Cambridge, and
Yeah.
like they were telling me that like 95% of their grade was the final exam. And I
Mhm.
was just like, that never would have worked for me. Like I would have just done nothing and then just bombed the exam. But yeah, but totally. And like getting back to our friendship, like I think honestly, like the trading club and like we went to University of Toronto, the trading competition together. Like I think you saw self in those moments because
Mhm.
like as much as we were trying to win the trading competition, like I was really just kind of goofing around and having fun. And like you were
Absolutely.
doing that, right? And it was like, because it wasn't this super competitive thing, but it was more like, yeah, we're just like hanging out on a cool weekend.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, like your journey, very similar, right? Was, there was the finance, you're working 110 hours a week, like trying to hammer it. And then, you were very successful at trading for a while. And then there was some market downturns. And that was when there was like the destabilization. And then it was sort of like, yeah, like you got a little bit into those pockets too of like the hopelessness and like, what do I do now? And who am I? And
Yeah.
then you transitioned out and just found this new way. And it was really cool to see that because I think, I mean, it took me like a lot longer to find the pieces that fit. And I kept thinking, like, if you could do it, then I could do it, and I could figure it out too. And there was some way that I could figure it out. And like, like I did, I don't know, 25 medications. I did like literally, I knew my therapist was a rock star, and I still did like 150 sessions. And like, we were like 6 to 9 months in, and she said to me, like, Rob, like, I don't understand. We've done all this work and you still feel terrible. And I was like, I and you were the one actually who recommended ketamine to me. And so that really helped. And that actually made me found my psychiatrist, who is another rock star, just with even the medication that I'm on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you talking about some of your specific mental health treatment, that is another thing that I've seen with you over the years. Like, your early experiences, and you've talked about this on your podcast, were pretty tough. Like, those medications at the beginning made you feel worse largely, or did nothing. You had some pretty invalidating experiences, I think, with psychiatrists and maybe also therapists.
Yeah.
Just not very helpful support. And I think you probably lost at least a couple of years of getting support because of those tough early experiences. And that's very painful. But my sense is that did happen.
Yeah. I stopped looking for help for 6 years.
6 years. Okay. So it wasn't a couple, it was 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in this sense, like, I'm very, very lucky because my first encounter with the mental health system was actually when I was in college. I was feeling overwhelmed and some depression. And I actually had a therapist who was at the MIT mental health clinic. And he was like a person who had just finished up his PhD in psychology. And he was fabulous. He was more of a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapist, very relational. I truly felt like he was listening, and that he cared and he was interested in me as a person. And I didn't even work with him for that long, but I think that really planted the seeds for me in terms of believing that therapy could be this transformative vehicle. And I think he inspired me in many ways to eventually become a therapist, although he wasn't the only inspiration. But I could just imagine, like, if my first experience, instead of being with him or with someone who weren't very helpful, would I have ever gone back? I don't know. I just don't know. So I think that, like, you had the more typical, the more difficult route, and maybe a message for the listeners is that you have a not very good first experience. It's super hard, and like, that's very real, but keep looking despite how hard it is. I think that's really important to hear.
Totally. And I think, yeah, I mean, wrapping up, so for me, right, like, I had basically a terrible therapist, and they kept telling me the same stuff. Like, your thoughts are illogical, and like, reframe them, and that's fine. And that does work, and we use it. And it's just, for some of these deep-seated trauma, it's not the most effective tool.
Yeah.
And that's why we talk about IFS on this show. We talk about psychedelics on this show. We talk about, like, I've even talked about EMDR, which I think is a fabulous modality, which I used with my therapist, but it's also the most effective therapist for therapy for PTSD. And PTSD is not just going to war. We'll just leave it there. But many, like Ellis, you and I both have a version of complex PTSD. And so for folks out there, if we sound familiar to you, you may have some complex trauma, which having a trauma-informed therapist would be super useful for you. And if you're in, Massachusetts and LA, reach out to Ellis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I, I had actually forgotten that I was the person who recommended you explore doing ketamine assisted therapy. Is that right?
And you also actually told me to find an IFS therapist.
That I do remember. That I do remember.
Yeah.
And actually, when you were doing that intensive work with her, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I was so impressed. I'd never met her, and I don't know her personally. But I was like, wow, like you have really found someone very good, very talented, and someone who has just tremendous qualities of self. I think courage,
Totally.
because like you were suffering a lot, and like there were parts of you that I think could bring out fear in a lot of therapists, and she was just hanging with you and moving with you, and I think that that's tremendous.
Yeah, she's a rock star. If you're in Alberta, uh, reach out and I'll send you her name. But yeah, she's a rock star, and like she doesn't realize how amazing she is, and so yeah, totally. Ellis, we got to wrap up. So one is go head on over to elliskim.com if you're in California or Massachusetts. You're welcome to, if you want to reach Ellis, you can also reach out to me and I'll put you in contact with him. We dropped his LinkedIn in the podcast notes so you can get him there or obviously on his website or through me. Ellis, is there anything you want to leave our leaders with today?
Yeah. Um, I think it's related to what I was saying earlier, which is that people's internal systems get reflected and amplified when they're leaders in their external systems. So if you're a leader at a corporation, your inner world will get reflected into the workplace that you're in, the community that you're in, the environment that you're in. So, and this is like kind of the bread and butter of what you're doing. This is why it's so important for leaders to do this individual and deeper work. But I also wanted to make a second point, which is that I actually think there are limits to individual work. And this is coming from an individual psychotherapist. So I think if you operate within a totally broken and bankrupt system, there's no amount of individual healing that's going to change the system to be self-led. So like a very simple example might be like, if you're a very like passionate and informed DEI officer at a tobacco company, you might be incredibly informed and educated and skilled about issues related to discrimination, racial justice, removing patriarchy, and all of these important issues. But ultimately, you're doing it within a corporation that kills people for profit. So I think that's an extreme example. But if you find yourself in this kind of context, don't don't feel pressure to solve this at the individual level. Like you're allowed to put yourself in different environments. You're allowed to take your talents elsewhere. It can be scary to do that, but I hope people do consider that that's a reality. That it's not all at the individual level.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. And folks, you'll hear more about that in my upcoming TED Talk, How to Deal with an Asshole Boss. We definitely lean into making self-led choices for yourself. And so this can mean leaving jobs that are not serving you or leaving bosses that are not serving you. So totally get there. For us, obviously, hit subscribe to the Leadership Launchpad Project on your favorite podcast platform. Leave us a rating and review on Apple and Spotify, and share the podcast with anyone in your life. For me, and then for anything leadership development, one-on-one mindset coaching and more, head on over to elitehighperformance.com for all of that. And for me, where I want folks to leave off is this. It's totally want to echo what Ellis said, is the self-work will change your life. And it'll give you the ability to choose what environments you are in. And so for me, that meant leaving corporate engineering. For Ellis, that meant leaving finance. And for you, it may not mean a complete pivot, but it could mean just leaving an asshole boss behind, right? And so the outcomes, and we talked about it, happier, clarity, confidence, the rest of the 8 C's and the 5 P's of self. And so we'll leave everyone there. Get on your journeys, do the self-work. It'll change everything. Ellis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob.
Absolutely. Couldn't have a better person on. Everyone, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next week.